Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and today we're doing a screencast on the Emmett Till story. And of course, Emmett Till, many people put as the beginning of the modern day civil rights movement because he was lynched, he was murdered, and that is going to have direct motivational factors on inspiring an entire generation to kind of fight for their rights and whatnot. So it's a tragic story, but we're going to tell it the best that we can. Emmett Till, as you can see in front of him, was 14 years old, and there he is, 14 years old, and he lived in Chicago, which of course is a northern city. The murder's going to take place in the south because he's going to get on a bus to go visit his family all the way down to Mississippi. Now, why is Mississippi relevant? Well, Mississippi is, of course, known to be in the deep South, and many people would arguably say that Mississippi had the highest of levels of racism and violence against African Americans and against white Americans that helped African Americans. Now, that said, this was his, I believe, great uncle or uncle, Mose Wright, living in Mississippi. And Mose Wright's going to have a lot of his family in the surrounding areas, even within his house. Now, context, Mississippi was the poorest state out of the United States at the time. It was, which I guess would be out of 48 states at that time, it was the most segregated state by many arguments and measurements. And since 1882, over 500 African Americans were on record for being lynched, maybe many more off record. And African Americans were disenfranchised, basically meaning they were denied their citizen rights, most notably the right to vote, which of course impacts their ability to influence laws and governments and those that enforce the laws. So in 1954, Mississippi was very ripe for this lynching or murder. And by ripe, I mean there were a lot of conditions that made a lot of tension and anger, which explains some of the context behind it. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, one of the most famous Supreme Court cases, occurred, which said that the federal government was going to force all states to basically end segregation in their schools. And that was very offensive to many people in the South. They're like, why is the federal government involved in this? This is a state issue. It should stay out of it. You're not going to force my white children to go to school with African American children, which many Southerners at that time found very offensive and angered them. Created fear and a lot of fear in Mississippi. Again, not the United States at its best at this time. So a lot of people in Mississippi, again, were worried for their white children and worried that if you combine children, there would be interracial dating, which was a very high concern among many of the racists of Mississippi at the time. So that tension in Brown v. Board of Education is going to be there, and a lot of the people in Mississippi are close to snapping, according to, really to themselves. And in 1955, Emmett Till is going to go to Mississippi in the middle of this tension, this kind of undeclared war. It's going to go all the way to Money, Mississippi, which you can kind of see there. And again, he's going to go to his uncle's home. And on August 28th, 1955, Emmett Till is going to be hanging out with his friends, his cousins, the friends of his cousins, and they're going to be hanging out near this convenience store. Now, that's not an accident because many of them were there buying, with candy or soda and hanging out. It was a place to hang out. There weren't phones at this time, right? So he said he wasn't. Suddenly, he got into a conversation with his friends, his cousins, and he said he wasn't intimidated to talk to any white girl. Kind of this etiquette of the South was African American kids or even adults weren't supposed to look at white women. They were supposed to keep their head down. They go across the street if you see white women coming, and it was just the etiquette at the time. So African American children were taught from a very young age almost to fear white girls. And Emmett Till is like, I'm from Chicago. I'm from the North. I'm not afraid of white girls. You guys are ridiculous. He even takes out a picture out of his pocket and shows his cousins and their friends, look, I know the picture's blurry, but I have class with white girls. In fact, I even have a white girlfriend, Emmett Till said. And this is, this wasn't the picture that he had at the time, but Joan Brody was the girl he was referring to. They weren't, and whatnot. That was his girlfriend. So anyway, his friends are like, there's no way. If you actually can get near a white girl, which seemed unbelievable, unfathomable to them down in Mississippi in the 1950s, prove it to us. Go into that store and talk to that white girl and prove to us that you're this tough or whatnot. So anyway, Carolyn Bryant was the woman behind the cash register in that Bryant convenience store. And so what actually happened in the store, we will never know. It's very complicated. There's a lot of theories, points of view, disagreements, and whatnot, but there were no direct witnesses, none that end up being alive or at least willing to tell the truth. So the facts are disputed. Now, one perspective was that he went in there to buy candy. And that's what he was doing, is buying candy while talking to her and whatnot. But he was trying to get a laugh out of his friends. So there was one accusation that as he left after buying the candy, he yelled "Bye, baby" in a flirtatious way. Calling somebody baby would be flirtatious, very inappropriate to do to any woman, but particularly an African American young male to a white woman. So that was another perspective. Was what Miss Bryant said was he said, "How about a date, baby?" That he grabbed her hand, he grabbed her waist. This is her first person explaining this to the police afterwards. That he asked her out on a date. He said, "Don't be afraid of me. I've been with white women before." That's what she said. Now, after he left the store, whatever happened, the next event is undisputed. She got out of that building, went through the back door, and went across the street to her car to get a gun. So whatever Emmett Till did, that was the reaction she had. Now, at this point, it was said that he wolf whistled at her, making a loud noise kind of at her. She's walking across the street, considered very rude, poor etiquette at the time. But again, he was 14 years old. That's what he did. So at this point, the adult that was there warned all the kids, particularly Emmett Till, that he needed to run, needed to get out of there, or she was going to quote him out of a documentary, blow his brains out. So that's where this tension was after he left the store. So run, and the kids did in fact run. Now, will we know the exact truth? No. Again, the story is filled with liars. It's told through a lens of racism, and of course, the person that was there, Matilda, is dead. So we will never know the exact truth. But those are a lot of the kind of disputed facts. So later that day, Rory Bryant, the husband of Carolyn Bryant from the store, and the brother-in-law are going to come in the middle of the night to Mose Wright's home, which is where Emmett Till was staying and at that time sleeping. And there's the home itself. And they pull out a gun. At this point, they say, "Take us to the N-word that did the talking." And at this point, Mose Wright's got a gun pointed to him, and he gets and wakes up his nephew, Emmett Till, and basically turns Emmett Till over. Now, Emmett Till's great aunt at this point offers them money. He says, "Let me give you money." They say no. And they just grab him, they throw him in the back, and they drive away with him at gunpoint. So at this point, Emmett Till does not return. He does not return for 3 days. That is such a large period of time and worry. So what actually happened? Well, people don't know, but basically they took him, and we found this out much later, to a plantation in Drew, Mississippi, a surrounding town, and into that shed, which belonged to the brother-in-law and whatnot. And there's another image of the shed that Emmett Till was brought into. They severely beat him, then they shot him in the head, and then they tied a cotton gin fan to him to weigh him down, and then they threw him at this spot in the Tallahatchie River. So this was all unknown at the time, but that was what occurred that night. His body was missing for 3 days. Nobody knew what was going to happen to him. And suddenly somebody found his body and whatnot. So they couldn't tell that it was Emmett Till because the body was so disfigured by being in the water for so long, but also because of that they shot him in the head and they beat him so severely. Now, but there was a ring on his finger with his initials on it. This is not the ring, but it had his initials on it, Emmett Till's E.T. And that's how they knew it was his body. That and the fact that he was taken away at gunpoint and was disappearing, and it disappeared. Now, back in Chicago at this point, his mother got the body shipped up and decided to have an open casket funeral. Now, his body was so disfigured that typically you would not have an open casket funeral. You wouldn't want people to see your son or really anybody in that way, in that condition. But she said that she needed to let the world know exactly what had happened to this son so that his death would not be for naught. She wanted people to be upset about this, and rightfully so. So it's an open casket, and the image is definitely shows kind of what the results of racism in Mississippi in the 1950s was. And again, you can kind of see what happened to Emmett Till and how badly they beat his body. It's a very sad, sad story, right? The purpose of this image is to show so people couldn't hide from what the impact in this country and children was of racism. So was anything done at this point? Well, those two were indeed arrested. After all, they had stolen the child, and this child then was found dead, kidnapped, and it became a national story. And the country was paying notice. There was a huge trial, and again, the world and our country paid attention. Now, the defense's claim was that they couldn't tell that the body was actually Emmett Till. How can you try these two people for murder when the person isn't actually dead? That was what they were arguing. Now, is he even dead? And now, of course, Mississippi only picked people to serve on juries that were a part of the voting pool. And of course, African Americans could not vote in Mississippi, so you had an all-white jury. This is going to be very, very important because Mississippi was known that if any white person was accused of hurting an African American, they almost always, to the tune of 100%, were declared innocent and allowed to go free. If any African American was accused of hurting somebody who was white, they almost always were convicted. It basically turned the entire judicial system against anybody who was African American. So either way, they were indeed found innocent, even though they showed up in the middle of the night and took him by gunpoint, and then he disappeared and was found dead. So there they are celebrating that they would, not go to prison and be innocent. Now there was systemic prejudice on these all-white juries, which we just talked about. Years later, the jurors were interviewed, and 10 of them, openly admitted that they knew they were guilty because they have some level of common sense, but they simply did not believe that life imprisonment or the death penalty, which is what they would have got if they declared guilty, was a fit punishment for white people that had killed black people. At this point, the people of Mississippi basically thought that African Americans were less human, and therefore a white person killing one of them does not warrant death. And that's why they did it. They knew they were guilty. Two of the jurors actually believed the defense's position, that they had no absolute proof that this was Emmett Till, even though he had the ring on it, ET, and whatnot. So that said, 12 out of 12 voted that they were innocent. Now, months later, Look magazine, which was popular at the time, I doubt it's still in business today, offered money to the two murderers to tell their real story. Now, I guess it was $3,600 to $4,000 each. And this journalist, William Bradford Huey, I believe, was the one that actually conducted the interviews, gave them the money and said, all right, well, tell me your story. Now, what they said, now you might be thinking, wait a minute, how can they tell their story, how they murdered somebody, when they go to prison? Well, under the Fifth Amendment, it says nobody can be put under double jeopardy. Double jeopardy basically means you can't be tried for the same crime twice. Because then if the government didn't like you for whatever reason, they could just put you on trial, you're found innocent, put you on trial again and again and again. Supposedly the British had done that to American colonists back in the day, and so we put it in our Fifth Amendment and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution so that our government would never be able to do that again. So that's it. They said they were going to beat him, scare him, and then throw him off the embankment, basically into the water. That's all they wanted to do, at that level of violence. But then suddenly, when they were being interviewed, they said something had changed. He wasn't saying he was sorry. He wasn't upset. He didn't act scared. He didn't act like they were better. He, in fact, kept fighting back. So he said he was as good as them. He called them bastards. He said, I'm not afraid of you. And the final straw, according to them, was he told the story that, what's the big deal? I have a white girlfriend back home. And at this point, he even showed the picture he had to them of his white girlfriend. And that was unbelievably what white racists in Mississippi feared at that time. That was exactly what was going to happen. The federal government was going to force African Americans and white American students together in a school, and that white males were going to date white women. It was a huge concern. So when that happened, that was the moment they told the reporter, we decided to murder him. That is unacceptable. Now, neither of them believed they were guilty of doing anything wrong. Can you believe that? You actually murdering a 14-year-old child and you don't think you did anything wrong? You're just upholding the way of life. So again, he would have lived if he had stayed in line. That was what they said. It was his fault. Now, why couldn't they be arrested again? We talked about this. The Constitution basically has the Fifth Amendment that says you can't be tried double jeopardy. So this story was published. The whole world, the country knew that they had done it. Now, there are going to be some consequences to that. Even in Mississippi, a majority of the population does not support murderers, and ultimately they are going to go bankrupt, and this is what remains of that store, right? So either way, did Emmett Till die? Ultimately, they're going to flee the state and live less than fruitful lives for the rest of their lives. They should have got much worse, of course. Now, did Emmett Till die for nothing? Well, obviously, this is a horrific and terrible story, but did at least something positive come out of it? Sad to say, but perhaps. So his killing, his lynching, his murder proved to be a catalyst. And what that did was it really angered millions of people. And that anger is going to result in the spark that creates the modern day civil rights movement, which led to some very, very positive changes in society, or at least got that movement started, right? So, so you could argue that the killing of Emmett Till led to the Montgomery bus boycott, which will be another topic at another time. The Montgomery bus boycott was the first real big victory of the modern civil rights era, and it's what led to the Martin Luther King gaining credibility, credence, gaining a leadership position to lead the civil rights movement. One could argue that without the killing of Emmett Till, Martin Luther King might never have been discovered or moved into a leadership position and had the influence that he had. Now, that doesn't make murder worth it. It's just explaining kind of cause and effect as far as historical outcomes. Now, we do have a new controversy a little bit as of 2017, which is, of course, much later than 1955 when Emmett Till was killed. Carolyn Bryant was still alive at that time, and she was over 80 years old. And in 1955, that's what she looked like, right? But she's going to she's also going to be interviewed by a reporter when she's very, very old. She says that when she testified that Emmett Till physically assaulted her, put his hand on her, asked her on a date on that, she exaggerated and lied about those things. So ultimately, this was the guy, Timothy Tyson, that interviewed her for this book, The Blood of Emmett Till. And Carolyn Bryant admit that he never actually grabbed her, that he probably spoke fresh to her in a flirtatious way that violated the norms of Mississippi, but he never grabbed her or put his hands on her. She admitted to lying. Now, again, this basically means that she is liable to a massive lawsuit or even lying under oath, perjury, criminal behavior. I mean, this is huge. The FBI opened up a case against her to follow up on this. They reopened the case. Carolyn Bryant could be in huge trouble. Of course, this is so many years later. Her family at this point told her to not talk anything, do not confirm anything with the FBI, don't even talk to them, which is probably wise from a lawyer's point of view. They claimed that she was misquoted. She was old and confused. Now, so the FBI went back to the reporter from 2017. So can we hear your interview tapes? Let's hear what she said. A lot of writers, that's what they do. They use tape recordings. So that said he didn't do that. He was old school. He took notes with a pen and paper. And these are his notes from that part of the interview where she admitted she was lying. And if you look, that part wasn't true. That's what he wrote. Now, this won't really hold up in court other than him having a witness. It's not as good as a recording of her voice. Other evidence, if you look at the comments before the trial, Moe's right. The kidnappers, only when they came to his door, only mentioned talk. So the kidnappers were like, show me the boy who did all that talk. They didn't say put his hands on her. So that's consistent with her lying. The sheriff basically arrested the killers. He told people he arrested the killers of those that were accused of making ugly remarks. So for the longest time, this was all about ugly remarks, not about physical touch. So when she later testified that, which of course led to a lot of problems, I mean, it sounds like she was certainly lying. Well, anyway, no resolution has come from that as of today, but another unresolved issues, were there others involved? It is possible and maybe even likely that those two murderers had their friends there as well. But we will never know because they never said that. Of course, they wouldn't want their friends to get in trouble. So we'll never find out the truth about that. Now, there was a memorial put up, and there it is right there, found at the spot of the river where his body was found. And there it is, and I think that's a very, very positive thing. But ultimately, they have needed in the last 20 years 4 signs. Why have they needed 4 signs? Because as they put the signs up, bullet holes would riddle the signs, destroy the signs. And those bullet holes happened quickly. They replaced the signs 3 times before finally replacing 2018 with a bulletproof sign. There was even a famous incident where those that were shooting it actually posted online about, I think Facebook at the time, about them before the sign shooting it up. They were later suspended from their college for that. But it does give you a little bit of the mentality of some of the racists that exists in Mississippi, but probably everywhere. So they got booted out of college. In 2019, it's correct what I said earlier, they finally put up a very expensive bulletproof sign, which sits there to this day. So what is the legacy? Well, of the Emmett Till story, number one, it created massive anger among the African-American community. And that is going to lead to a desire to fight, to create change. Sometimes people aren't willing to take risks or fight until they're pushed into it. Many people consider this the push they needed, the beginning of the civil rights movement, which of course was the Montgomery bus boycott, which happened within a year of that. If you could read the following statement by Rosa Parks, who kind of was the spark of the Montgomery bus boycott. Parks later said, when she did not get up and move to the rear of the bus, which started the Montgomery bus boycott, I thought of Emmett Till and I just couldn't go back. And he was on her mind when she refused to get up, which started, some people consider that the start of the civil rights movement, the catalyst. So she's going to get arrested, and of course it's going to start a bus boycott, and Martin Luther King is going to be put in charge of that bus boycott. You could argue that the killing of Emmett Till, the lynching, is the catalyst for the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks' actions. So that is the significance of the Emmett Till story. Of course, we'll dive a little more deeper into those other topics as we move forward. Um, Thank you, and look forward to seeing you on future screencasts.